I'm going to pile on and offer my own sort of framework for understanding China, hopefully bringing together some of the threads of the past evening and day, and linking a little bit the domestic and the foreign policy. If there's any time at the end, I'll also try to provide a little bit of a bridge to Robert's remarks on the US-China bilateral relationship, but my guess is we won't have enough time for that. So let me just start by taking you back to the 19th Party Congress in October of 2017, when Xi Jinping was reselected for his second term as General Secretary of the Communist Party. And in his acceptance speech, about halfway through, it was a 3.5-hour speech, he uttered the phrase, "China has stood up, grown rich, become strong." And a little bit later in the speech, he said, "and is moving towards center stage." And that phrase, almost more than anything else that I have encountered, really, I think, helps encapsulate the evolution of China's political ambitions, as well as how Xi Jinping sees his own tenure within the context of recent, sort of contemporary Chinese political history. So, the first period, or what I term the first revolution, China stood up, was, of course, Mao Zedong standing up against the Japanese invaders, but also Mao and the Communist Party standing up against the ruling party of the time, the Kuomintang, and creating the contemporary Chinese Communist Party state in 1949. If you fast forward then again to 1979, you have the entrance of Deng Xiaoping. This is the period of China growing rich, period of reform and opening up. As Ang Yuanyuan mentioned yesterday, Deng Xiaoping really undertook some significant shifts, right? He moved China away from the single-man authoritarian form of leadership to a more consensus and collective-based decision-making process. He also introduced the market into the Chinese economy, and also began the process of allowing civil society to flourish, the beginning of China's civil society and non-governmental organizations really in the mid-1990s. And he welcomed ideas, foreign influences, both in terms of foreign capital, but also foreign non-governmental organizations began to be established in China. And of course, very famously, he maintained a low-profile foreign policy. He wanted to focus on developing China at home, didn't want to be distracted by external events or external problems. So that was what Deng himself termed China's second revolution, that period of 30 years, a little bit more, that he ushered in, until 2012. And I do believe, although some things that we've seen under Xi Jinping emerged slightly prior to the advent of his leadership, I do believe that he has been the third transformative leader in China, beginning with Mao. And in many respects, this is the period, of course, where China becomes strong and moves towards center stage. I think Xi Jinping has upended much of what we've come to understand as the China model, as that model of reform and opening up, to begin to create his own model of Chinese politics. So what I want to do is just describe for you what I see as sort of the four most important structural shifts underway in China today, things that have taken place really over the past 6 years. The first is a shift away from that consensus and collective-based decision-making process back to a more single-man authoritarian form of rule. Xi Jinping has amassed an enormous amount of institutional power in his own hands. He sits on top of most of the important committees and commissions that oversee broad swaths of Chinese policy, whether we're talking about reform and the deepening of economic reform, or Taiwan policy, or national security, cyber. Xi Jinping is in charge of all of these commissions and committees. He has also launched a massive anti-corruption campaign, which has gotten a lot of attention here in the United States in the media. I think what distinguishes his campaign from others, because it's not new, anti-corruption campaigns have been a staple of Chinese political life dating back centuries, and Mao launched his first campaign in the early 1950s, right after he took power. But what has distinguished it is just the robust nature of it, the fact that every year more Chinese officials are disciplined than the year before. I think many of us expected that it would be a very typical campaign. It would start up and then it would sort of wax and wane. After a few years, it would kind of die off. But last year, in 2018, some 623,000 officials were disciplined, right? That's 100,000 more than the year before. So he has only increased the intensity of this campaign. Some people ask, is the campaign a real anti-corruption campaign, or is it really just targeted against his political enemies? I mean, of course, it's a real campaign. He doesn't have 627,000 or 623,000 political enemies. But certainly there is an element of the campaign that has been targeted at political competitors. And there was a study that was done by a professor who's now up at Harvard in the early years of the campaign that demonstrated that about 40% of the officials who were at the vice ministerial level or above, which is a pretty high level, were in some way connected, right, some way tied into Xi's political competitors. So definitely an element of removing his political competition. And of course, as you heard yesterday, he has also deinstitutionalized the succession process. He failed to signal a successor for himself as general secretary in the next round in 2022, which he was expected to do in 2017 at the 19th Party Congress. And of course, he abolished the two-term limit for the presidency that Deng Xiaoping had put in place in the early 1990s. So this allows him to hold the three most important positions, at least for, obviously for this 5 years, for the next 5 years or beyond, really until the Communist Party and he decide that he should no longer hold it. So that's the first thing he's done, is really moved away from that consensus collective-based decision-making process to control much more power in his own hands. The second thing I think that he's done is really to reassert the power of the Chinese Communist Party back into the everyday life of the Chinese people and the Chinese economy in a way that, during Deng Xiaoping's period, he really withdrew the party. But Xi has really reasserted the power of the party. The party is very important to him. The anti-corruption campaign is one element of this, but also just the party at the forefront of the political system and reasserting that has been important. How is that manifested? I think a couple of different ways. We could look at the surveillance system that China has put in place, somewhere between, the numbers range from 176 million to 200 million cameras that are capable of facial recognition, but also moving toward voice recognition and gait recognition so that you can identify people by how they walk. Right? So really extraordinary, and the number that's posted out there of the number of cameras that they want to have to roll out in the next year or so is up to 600 million cameras. Imagine that. I think if you want to understand the sort of the excesses to which this can be taken, you could look at Xinjiang Autonomous Region in the far western part of the country, which has been transformed, I think, into nothing less than a police state at this point, right, with the Uyghurs. And it's a combination, it's a really fascinating and terrible combination of traditional forms of Chinese political repression, right, sending teams of Communist Party officials into the homes of the Uyghurs to live there and to monitor them and to inculcate them and to make sure that they're not, maintaining beards and headscarves and practicing religion, with the high-tech capabilities of the country now, with all of the cameras and biometrics, and recently, of course, there were articles about the DNA taking of the Uyghurs, and of course the re-education camps, right, of which we hear there are as many as 1 million Uyghurs in these re-education and to some extent forced labor camps. So I think that is the sort of excess element of this sort of party intrusion into the life of the people. There's also the social credit system. A lot has been written about this. In the US media. I would simply say it's an interesting idea, right? Evaluating the trustworthiness, the political and economic trustworthiness of citizens, and then rewarding or punishing them accordingly. There is no national system at this point. It's, I think, about 40 pilot projects, and even when it becomes national so that every Chinese citizen is registered in one form or another by 2020, it still won't be one program across the entire country. I will say that when I was doing interviews for the book that I wrote, I interviewed 15, just off the cuff, sort of 15 young people who worked in 3Q, which is a kind of WeWork thing, a beautiful space. They have a number of them. Soho Real Estate makes them, and so they're sort of shared working spaces. And so I just walked around and asked 15 random people, mostly in their 20s and 30s, what do you think about this social credit system? And two of them didn't know what I was talking about, but most of them were actually pretty positive about it. And one person said, there's not a lot of trust in Chinese society outside the family, outside an immediate circle of friends, and this will help us understand whom to trust. And it was just a good reminder to me of the importance of political culture, that what we take as sort of dominant or primary values might not be shared everywhere else. I think as the social credit system evolves, as all the metrics are determined, is it going to be how many hours of video games are you playing, or is it going to be, not only are you participating in a protest, but is your friend participating in your protest, right? Because if your friend is, that will affect your score negatively as well. There are lots of different things that are being tested out. It may emerge that many more Chinese are not particularly happy with what's happening. A lot of the public shaming, putting people's faces on billboards. It's, again, this kind of fascinating combination of traditional sort of Maoist techniques with the sort of sophistication of technology. And then I think on the economic front, you could look at the sort of growing role of the party in Xi's effort to enhance the role of party committees in not only state enterprises, but also private enterprises and joint ventures. And typically, so now I think that the number is about 70% of all private enterprises and joint ventures have party committees. And party committees are simply committees that are made up of party members who are working in any individual company. And in the recent past, I think most of them didn't really do much, right? You might meet, you might discuss recent laws and regulations, you might read through Xi Jinping's speech and talk about it. You might be the group that is responsible for some good social initiative, a tree planting campaign in the older days, but you really didn't play a significant role in the leadership of the company. But what Xi Jinping is looking to do is to have that party committee play a more important role in the economic decision-making of these companies, right? So to have the chair of the party committee become the chairman of the board of the company. And so I was talking to a person who's in charge of a large German multinational who's in charge of the company in China for the China operations. And he said that the party committee had tried to tell them where to invest. And they pushed back and said no, and they were successful in saying no. But you get the idea that Xi Jinping is really trying to extend the reach of the party, right? State-owned enterprises are extensions of the party, of course, do have to respond very directly to the party's demands, but now to extend that power and that influence to make these companies kind of arms of Chinese government interest and influence. So a pretty significant shift from the Deng era of trying to enhance the role of the market. The third sort of big shift I see is the creation of what I call a virtual wall of restrictions and regulations that allow the Chinese leadership to control more closely what comes in and what goes out of the country. So the internet would be the prime example of this, but I think there are others that are perhaps less familiar. For example, the law on the management of foreign NGOs. And that came into force in January of 2017. And foreign NGOs, as I think Ma Jun was saying, you saw his partnership for some of his projects with NRDC, which of course is a US-based environmental NGO, have played a really important role in the development of civil society in China through partnerships, through education. I remember in the very early stages of the environmental NGO movement in China that the National Committee on US-China Relations and others used to bring some activists, I don't know whether Ma Jun, you were part of that, but would bring them here to the United States for some training. Some of them would be placed in a US NGO for a period of 3 months to learn how they operate. Foreign foundations have played a really important role in funding civil society development in China. So by the time 2016, there were upwards of 7,000 foreign NGOs, and certainly not all US NGOs, many from many different countries. US NGOs who were actively engaged, foreign NGOs, who were actively engaged in a wide range of efforts working with their partners in China on the environment, on healthcare, on poverty alleviation, on education of migrant children. But when the law came into force, right, it moved control for these NGOs, for these foreign NGOs, from the Ministry of Civil Society to the Ministry of Public Security. It put in place very onerous registration requirements, and you saw the number now that have been formally registered to operate, right? So this is now 2 years on, is somewhere just slightly above 400. So we've gone from 7,000, more than 7,000, to slightly above 400. And this has had enormous ramifications for many NGOs, not for the big and frontline NGOs like Ma Jun's, obviously very celebrated in China for their work, well known, but for many other much smaller NGOs with less capacity, the loss of that connection with foreign NGOs has been quite significant for their future work. Made in China 2025, I think, is also a good example on the economic front. And Made in China 2025 is as far as I can tell, is basically about protecting Chinese firms from real competition with multinationals across 10 areas of cutting-edge technology, right? Everything from artificial intelligence to new energy vehicles to medical devices. And how is this playing out? Even though the Chinese have now, in the face of President Trump's, efforts, have now taken the name off of Made in China 2025, so there is no more Made in China 2025. Of course, there is still Made in China 2025. It just doesn't have the name anymore. But it did allow President Trump to declare victory around that. And so you say they stopped it because I didn't like it, but it's still there, of course. How does it actually operate? Let me give you one example. The Financial Times did a great piece on this maybe a year and a half ago, where they looked at medical devices. And they found that Fujian province had put in place a new regulation that said hospitals could not be reimbursed, right, for operations or treatment that used 15 different medical devices unless they used Chinese-made medical devices. Right? So that's the kind of, you heard a little bit about, up here is Beijing, and you give a directive, and how that is actually implemented or developed at the local level may vary from one place to another. But that's the kind of really creative, right, restriction or regulation or law that can come into place to try to fulfill a Made in China 2025 directive. And that's what will make it so very difficult as the trade talks continue, actually to get at this issue, because it's not going to be simply Beijing saying, oh, we finished this program or effort. It's going to be really looking at the local level and all the myriad ways in which it actually could be implemented to try to get at those as well. And then finally, the fourth structural shift is the move, and I think most noticeable to people outside China, is the move from a low-profile foreign policy to a far more ambitious and expansive foreign policy. And I think it's evident in sort of three different levels. The first is around issues of Chinese sovereignty. And I know Wu Xunbo talked a little bit about this yesterday. But let me say a few more words. So, one of the things that Xi Jinping has focused on has been his desire to, reunify China, right? To unify China, and that includes the South China Sea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong and Macau. And you can see that in his first term, he has made certainly significant progress in the South China Sea, where he has militarized 7 artificial features, despite telling President Obama that he would not militarize any of these artificial features. In terms of Hong Kong, definitely increased political repression, no matter how far Beijing is from Hong Kong. We've definitely seen efforts to curtail political expression in Hong Kong. And in Taiwan, with the election of Tsai Ing-wen 2 years ago, which is, she represents the DPP, which is the pro-independence party, although she hasn't moved toward any sort of announcement of independence at all, has been extremely moderate. Xi Jinping has undertaken a number of both coercive measures, but also some inducements. So we've seen, for example, that they've called for a significant drop in mainland Chinese tourists to Taiwan, in an effort to kind of put pressure on the Taiwanese economy. They have Xi Jinping has cut off all of the bilateral discussions between Taiwan and the mainland, so they've had no they have a semi-formal dialogue that has been going on, and he cut that off. He's offered some inducements to Taiwanese businesses to relocate to the mainland by telling them they would receive national treatment, get all the benefits of a Chinese mainland company. And certainly for Taiwanese students, there's interest in going to study in the mainland as well. But there's a sort of a chill, and I should say he's also reintroduced sort of an effort that had been underway up until Ma Ying-jeou, the previous Taiwanese president, was in office, who was viewed as more favorably inclined toward the mainland, of sort of buying off the few countries that still recognize Taiwan diplomatically. And I think it's gone from 22 to 17 at this point in terms of countries that recognize Taiwan. So anyway, and there's some efforts on the military side as well. So a number of efforts to try to squeeze Taiwan to sort of limit its international space and to maneuver. So I think that's, and he has called for sort of reunification by 2049. That's his soft target date. The second is the Belt and Road Initiative. And again, I know that this was discussed in previous sets of remarks. Let me just add a little bit. I think the initial impetus, and Xi Jinping sort of outlined Belt and Road back in 2013 in two speeches, the first in Xinjiang and the second, first in Kazakhstan and the second in Indonesia. I think the initial impetus for this was, yes, in part, to contribute to the very dramatic needs for infrastructure developed globally, but also to export Chinese overcapacity, right, in a lot of the sort of heavy industries, because China didn't have as much need for infrastructure development within its own boundaries, and also to link some of the lesser developed parts of the country to external markets. So it wasn't just sort of this beneficent program. There was definitely some very significant self-interest that also drove this. In terms of its actual impact, I think it certainly has had impact, but probably not as much as many people imagine. So if you look at the levels of investment, actually, in Belt and Road countries relative to Chinese overseas investment elsewhere, up until last year, so not including 2018, Belt and Road countries only received about 12% of Chinese overseas investment. The vast majority came to the United States and Europe. Right? So we just want to keep this a little bit in perspective. So the big announcement out there is all about Belt and Road, but actually in terms of investment, it's actually a very small percentage. There is a lot of lending that goes out to Belt and Road countries. And the final point I'll make in terms of the investment is, it's tempting, because this is the way that the media describes it a lot, to think that China is the largest source of investment everywhere. In fact, if you look, who the largest source of investment in Africa is? Any guess? Last year, it's the United States, right? The United States, by quite a significant amount. Largest source of investment in Southeast Asia is the European Union, right? Followed by Japan. And then it alternates between China and the United States one year and the next year. So it bears looking beyond the headlines to actually what's taking place on the ground, to understand sort of the relative impact and what's actually transpiring. We don't have, in the United States, Japan, the EU, our presidents don't go out as much and say, we're going to be investing all of this, because we don't have the capacity to do that. We don't have, firms at our disposal that we know will go out and invest, $50 or $60 billion. But actually what the private enterprises do, from many of these places is actually even more significant. I also think what's interesting about the Belt and Road is that it's evolved and it's morphed. And there's a tendency to think that it's this sort of big, giant, well-conceived and articulated plan from Xi Jinping at the outset, but that's not at all what it has been. It began as an infrastructure project, ports, railroads, highways. It's evolved into then a digital Belt and Road to include e-commerce and fiber optic cables and satellite systems. There's a security component to it, right? So China now, I think it is up to 50 ports in maybe more than 80 countries, has either outright ownership or a controlling stake in 50 ports. And even though it says that these ports are for commercial purposes, we've seen that PLA Navy ships have stopped by many of these ports in the recent past. And I will say, when I was in Beijing a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago now, I was at a security conference and asked a couple of the military people who were there, like, how many bases do you think you want, right? And they said, 100 or more. And I don't know whether they really want 100 or more, but I think, we would be foolish, right, not to understand that as China's economy has expanded, as its political interests have expanded, its security interests are expanding along with that. And as I think Wu Xinbo said, it's a natural evolution. But that old sort of idea that China would never have bases, which was something that they said all the way up through recent past, I think is certainly no longer the case. And then I would also say that there's become a political element within the Belton Road, and that a number of countries now, I think it's up to 16, have adopted China's surveillance system, right? Peru, Bolivia is looking at it, a number of countries in Africa. Chinese officials are in Tanzania, training the officials there on how to manage the internet and political dissent, and so I think in civil society. So I think, this is not something China intended from the outset, but as opportunities have emerged, the Chinese have been, I think, very good about taking advantage of those opportunities. And then finally, I would say the third area, if you have the sovereignty issue and then Belton Road, I think the third area, and one that I don't think has been discussed this far, is the issue of global norms and institutions. Actually, it was discussed a little bit. Is China looking to reform those norms? Is it looking to upend those institutions? And I think it's a combination, and it just depends. I think, as Wu Xinbo pointed out, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank operates according to global standards, the same standards of the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. In fact, its charter was written by a former World Bank, an American, a former World Bank legal counsel. So it very much adheres to those norms. Are there other norms around human rights that China's trying to shape in the United Nations in different ways? Absolutely. Is China bringing a different voice from that of the United States and some other countries in terms of internet governance? Absolutely. I think the important thing when we're talking about China and the sort of global system is to be very careful to look at, where is China basically just putting up additive institutions and ideas, like the AIB, where is it seeking to change things in ways that are maybe make things better, right? Reform within the voting rights of the International Monetary Fund, and where is it doing things that perhaps are antithetical to our interests and values, maybe on human rights, where we really need to push back. So I have 1.5 minutes. Let me just maybe provide a tiny bridge to Robert and say, I know in Martin's initial comments, he said, it's the U.S. has changed, right? The U.S.-China relationship has changed because U.S. policy has changed. So let me just offer a counter perspective, drawing on my good friend Wang Jise, who I think many of you know is one of China's premier scholars of the U.S.-China relationship. And he said in a recent interview that the U.S. has caused problems for us for 200 years around a whole range of issues, and we've pushed back as we should have. But if you want to understand why U.S. policy has changed now, it's because China's policy has changed. Right? And so I think no matter that certainly the Trump administration has introduced a number of new elements into both U.S. foreign policy more broadly and also into the U.S.-China relationship, much of what has transpired in the past few years in terms of the bilateral relationship between the United States and China has to do with the changes that have come under Xi Jinping and the recognition in the United States that this is a very different China. All right, and that there needs to be a different response. In terms of how we respond, so now I'm at 6 seconds. Let me just say, I subscribe to the 4 C's, which is basically cooperate, coordinate, compete, and counter. And I think we've done a not good job on cooperate, and actually much better job on coordinate than many people would think in terms of coordinating with our allies. A mediocre job on competing, which is basically developing our own internal resources, right, to compete. And we've really moved hard on the counterpart. I think we need to rebalance that a little bit, but I will leave that to Robert to flesh out. I don't even know whether he agrees with me, but in any case, thank you very much.